Good afternoon. I'm Mahan Mirza, teaching professor at the Keough School and executive director of its Ansari Institute. Welcome both to our audience in the room and viewers online to part 2 of our 3-part series on the 20th anniversary of September the 11th, 2001. In case you missed it, you can watch part 1 of the series on our website and YouTube channels, featuring a keynote by Andrew Basevich and respondents Perrin Gurel, Jamila Afghani, and Ibrahim Musa. And mark your calendars for part 3 on November 3rd with a keynote by Stephen Wald and respondents Nazia Kazi and Lisa Shirk. Today's event is called Pax Americana. What kind of peace do we find ourselves in 2 decades after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? How do we understand the role of religion in relation to the war on terror and US foreign policy? How has global humanitarian and development work been impacted by the climate of conflict? Before inviting our panelists to engage these and related questions, we'd like to recognize the many sponsors of this series at the Keough School of Global Affairs: the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, along with the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights, Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, and the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. A special thanks to David Courtwright and the Global Policy Initiative for leading this school-wide collaboration. After the keynote, today's 2 panelists will speak in this order: Atalia Omer, professor of religion, conflict, and peace studies, and co-director of the Contending Modernities Research Initiative at the Kroc Institute, and Ray Offenheiser, William J. Pulte, director of the Pulte Institute for Global Development and professor of the practice at the Keough School. And now, please welcome the Dean of the Keough School, Scott Appleby, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Please hold your applause. Thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to introduce our speaker. We are privileged to have as our second speaker in the 20th anniversary of September 11th series, one of the leading experts on religion in politics, in US foreign policy, and in public affairs more broadly. Her important theoretical work in these areas grounded in her studies of the Middle East, notably regarding Turkey and Iran, and the entanglements of those nations with the US security studies and foreign policy elite, guided in their reckonings and policymaking by a secularist myopia, which has, our speaker has argued, led to one misbegotten intervention in international affairs after another, especially with respect to political Islam. Elizabeth Schachman Hurd comes to us today from Northwestern, where she is professor of political science and religious studies and holds the Crown Chair in Middle East Studies. Beth holds a bachelor's from Wesleyan, a master's from Yale, and the PhD from Johns Hopkins. At Northwestern, she co-directs Talking Religion, Publics, Politics, and the Media, and the Global Politics and Religion Research Group. Professor Hurd staked her claim as a leading authority on religion's role in global affairs first with the 2007 publication from Princeton University Press of The Politics of Secularism in International Relations, a really, truly groundbreaking book, which argued compellingly that the secularist divisions between religion and politics are not fixed, as commonly assumed, but socially and historically constructed. Examining the philosophical and historical legacy of the secularist traditions that shape European and American approaches to global politics, she shows why this matters for contemporary international relations, in particular for that relationship I mentioned before, the US, the European Union, Turkey, Iran, excuse me. The politics of secularism in international relations develops a new approach to religion and international relations that challenges realist, liberal, and constructivist assumptions that religion has been excluded from politics in the West. What assumptions? Sorry, it seems so silly. But anyway, in 2007, it didn't seem as silly as it should, and Beth really helped it to reveal it as such. The first book to consider secularism as a form of political authority in its own right. The book describes two forms of secularism and their far-reaching global consequences. That was the first big groundbreaking book, and as all top-notch scholars do, Beth's thinking has evolved and expanded, and she's been working on several projects since then. She is the author of Beyond Religious Freedom, The New Global Politics of Religion, again published with Princeton in 2015, and more recently with Winnie Sullivan, At Home and Abroad, The Politics of American Religion, published this year. I'm going to read to you just a paragraph or two quickly, and I'll conclude, of a review from TLS about her Beyond Religious Freedom. I just enjoyed it. In her admirably combative, and I would say that at least the four of us here are all admirably combative. So I'm part of the same tribe. In her admirably combative Beyond Religious Freedom, The New Global Politics of Religion, Elizabeth Hurd of Northwestern University, Illinois, applies the tools of political science to tease out the assumptions underlying such a policy. An example of more active intervention, this time by the U.S. government, was the payment of $144,000 in 2005 by a Pentagon contractor to Sunni religious scholars in Iraq. The contractor itself, the Lincoln Group, was paid to identify religious leaders in Anbar province who could help persuade Sunnis to take part in elections and reject the insurgency. The rapid growth of interest in religion among political scientists over the past 2 decades, reacting against simplistic forms of secularization theory, might lead one to infer that Western foreign policy was secularist in its bias until recently, but Hurd shows convincingly that during the early Cold War, the U.S. government undertook what was called a religious offensive against communist secularism, a campaign for global spiritual health. The U.S. Supreme Court has refrained from ruling on the First Amendment to the Constitution, which in effect prohibits governments from preferring one religion over another. Applies to U.S. action abroad as well as domestically. We could talk about our various committees on this question in terms of engaging religions abroad. Religion has now come to the fore in North America. This is the end of the paragraph I'm reading from TLS on European public policy circles, especially in the drive to liberate the social capital of tolerant religion from the bad kind of religion, their threats to peace and harmony. We will talk about good and bad religion, I'm sure. So that was from TLS on the second book. Professor Hurd's writings have appeared in many important outlets, including the Boston Review, Public Culture, the Atlantic, Chicago Tribune, Foreign Policy, and the Washington Post. Her research has been supported by the Henry Luce Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and she is a major contributor over the years to a very important blog, if we call the Eminent Frame that. It's been in existence for not since 2007 or so, right? 2007. So Beth was really an important generator of the really outstanding state-of-the-art essays that you can still find in the Eminent Frame that really keep us up to date with the more important cutting-edge theoretical contributions on religion. So I'll conclude by saying that Beth has been a friend of ours and a colleague, a friend of Contending Modernities, and all of us don't always agree all the time, and that makes it fun because if we all agree about everything, it's just not as exciting. So I'm really delighted to present to you Elizabeth Hurd.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you, Scott. Thank you all for being here, everyone. That was such a nice introduction. I had forgotten about that TLS review. And it's funny that you brought that up because my very first sentence of my talk today was to refer back to the Cold War. Because the idea, in fact, I got in an argument with my publisher of that last book because the subtitle was The New Global Politics of Religion. And I kept saying, but it's not new. And I say in the book that it's not new. And what's so interesting is that this has been going on in different ways and different permutations using different words and different categories, but it's been going on. Religion is a tool of statecraft, and the state power has been going on as long as the US has been a great power. And they were like, oh, but new sounds so much better. It sounds more exciting. So we're going with that. And I was like, okay, you call it what you want. I'm just the author, but that's all right. So during the Cold War, as Scott said, the US indeed did seek to secure what was known as global spiritual health. And we had an office that undertook what they themselves called a religious offensive. And mainly this was in Southeast Asia. I'm not going to go into the details because I'm focusing on the US today and war on terror policy. But the idea is that the US, and as part of its efforts to combat communism during the Cold War, undertook this religious offensive, a series of what they saw as spiritual interventions in Southeast Asia, where they tried to intervene in Buddhist communities there who they thought may or could succumb to communism or to the communist temptation. And so they sent out people from the US government, and they had an office for this religious offensive. And there's been some interesting historical work on there in a book called The Spiritual Industrial Complex. That's for another day, though. I just wanted to set that up right away as the precedent for the war on terror, which is what we're here to talk about today, during which the US sought, of course, as you all know, to combat and to counter violent forms of Islam through the promotion of religious freedom. And since 9/11 in particular, US efforts have targeted Islam and Muslims both at home and abroad. I'm often asked that question, well, religious freedom is kind of general. Why is this really only about Muslims? And the answer is no, it's not, but it is predominantly in terms of looking at the actual policies and looking at where most of the money went and where a lot of the worry and the concern among the security establishment was. So Islam was basically seen as a problem that needed to be fixed. They needed a reformation. And that is the sort of talk that is still circulating in certain quarters. So what I'm going to suggest today is that this particular post 9/11 religion-heavy US foreign policy is misguided. And that we need to de-emphasize religion in general, and probably Islam in particular, as fixtures and as foci of American foreign policy. When we elevate religion above other factors, it does damage to the cause of religious tolerance, both domestically and internationally. So the best way to support tolerance of all kinds, religious and otherwise, is to step back from the emphasis on religion and religious freedom in favor of justice, equality, and respect for diversity. To move away from this focus on religion, however, to be very clear, does not mean ignoring religion. It does not mean denigrating religious people or actors or institutions. To the contrary, I think it involves a certain respect for the rich diversity and the variety of religious traditions in social, legal, and political lives around the world, and the fact that they're always embedded in our public lives and in various aspects of social life. So this, as I keep saying now, requires that the government tread lightly. I'm going to develop this argument a bit today by contrasting what I call the religion-heavy US government narrative of the war on terror with the promise of the Arab Spring protests a decade ago. This is just by way of an illustration of what I actually am talking about. I'll then suggest that to enforce the right to religious freedom requires defining religion, which is not the job of the government. So one of those two arguments you might find persuasive. And if not, as Scott said, I'd love to keep talking because I think that the part of the challenge here is to open up spaces like this where we can have an open conversation about these topics that are complex and contested and sometimes difficult to bring out into the open. I'll then conclude with 4 recommendations for US policy. So that's kind of in anticipation of the questions I usually get when I give this argument, which is, well, if this is not the right path, then what should we be doing? And I think that's a fair question, particularly given that this is a global policy initiative in which scholars are intended to make substantive contributions to public debates, rather than only just criticize them, but actually give some concrete alternative pathways for policymakers to consider going forward. So first of all, religious freedom promotion politicizes religious difference. So what I want to suggest is that in Muslim majority contexts in particular, US advocacy for religious freedom during the War on Terror consolidated what we might call a culturalist view of the so-called Muslim world. And the notion of the Muslim world itself is a culturalist view. It suggests that the way we should see that part of the world is through the lens of Muslimness. And if you imagine, people talking about the Christian world, I mean, we don't say, well, we're going to visit the Christian world when we go to Europe. I mean, that would be weird. So think about the culturalization of these geographic regions too, and what kind of work that does in providing kind of this anchor of Islam and Muslimness as this kind of boogeyman, right? So this culturalist view, and in this view, politics is said to be driven by religion. And Islam is the target of government reform. So you've got the Muslim world, they've got problems, we've got to target Islam. And this religion-heavy storyline revives an old culturalist canard that denies individuals in these, quote, less developed countries, or going back again to the Cold War, the third world, any capacity to construct their own autonomous field of politics. They're not political agents, they're just Muslims following Islam. Nadia Marzouki, I think, makes this argument most clearly. It infantilizes people. It depicts Muslims as having fallen under the sway of an irrational force that they cannot control. And in the Arab Spring protests a decade ago, we saw activists across the region challenge this assumption. And I very intentionally am bringing in to our conversation about 9/11 and its aftermath, the Arab Spring and its aftermath, because I think it is just as important of a world historical moment as was 9/11. And so to juxtapose them and think about these two historical moments together, I think is really interesting and productive. I'm hoping that you will agree with me. So what happened in these protests? We saw protesters unite across the religious secular divide to fight autocracy, greed, corruption, and the abuse of power by state and economic elites across the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region. The idea that politics can be explained by Islam, or that this was somehow driven by the fact that the individuals protesting were Muslim, should have been put to rest once and for all by these protests. Instead, we have seen this same racist culturalist notion, Muslim world, Muslim politics, rearing its head over and over again in analyses of the Syrian war, and very recently, even in discussions of what's happening right now in Afghanistan. In the case of Syria, I'm happy to talk about Afghanistan more later, but let me just talk for a moment about Syria. It's very common to hear the war there described as an armed conflict that pitted Sunnis, who are, after all, the majority of the population of Syria, against the Alawis or Alawites who backed the regime and their Shiite allies, namely Iran and Hezbollah. In this telling, in this depiction of the war, in this framing of the war, Christians and other innocent minorities were under siege, caught in the crossfire, and afraid they would be oppressed by a Sunni majority in a post-Assad Syria. What this does, and this was a dominant framing, was that it locates Syria as the latest in a long chain of Middle Eastern countries riven by allegedly intractable sectarian religious difference that lead allegedly to interminable chaos, violence, and religious persecution. Because religious divisions divide people's identities in this region, the story goes, history says there's no choice for the Americans, but we let them fight it out. While at the same time, of course, doing everything in our power, including all kinds of covert operations to ensure that whoever supports our interests and the flow of oil and all the things that we need prevail in the long run. So this story has enormous appeal, both inside and outside of Syria, not least for the regime itself, which after all has emerged victorious. They won. It paints a picture of a Middle East in which religious and sectarian difference determine political outcomes. It suggests that violence is inevitable and it may even be biologically predetermined. And it exonerates those that failed to act in the face of extreme violence against innocent civilians, as when Syrian government forces found and shot 49 children during a massacre in Hula. The religion-heavy account is politically divisive, and I would say even dangerous. It makes it seem normal that people would ground their claims and preferences in religious identity. It hardens lines of religious difference and makes societies more prone to conflicts along those very lines. Rather than calming tensions, emphasizing religion entrenches divisions between communities by defining interests in religious terms. So it creates the world that it purports to describe. Drawing a line under these identities as the factor that trumps all others aggravates sectarian tensions rather than placating them. In reality, to make matters more complex, Syrians themselves don't conform to the religion-heavy stereotypes proposed by many policymakers and pundits. Some do identify strongly with ethnic and religious communities, but like people everywhere, many Syrians hold multiple allegiances. They may sympathize with more than one religious identity or perhaps none at all. They may have a mixed background. They may not fit neatly into boxes of religious identification at all. So religion-heavy policy has a problem because it puts those who refuse to define themselves politically in religious terms in an impossible position. They're between a rock and a hard place. Either they have to make political claims and decisions about their allegiances and their preferences based on their religious identity, or they're left with no grounds from which to speak. They're shut out of the public conversation. This happened in Bosnia, as the IR and political theorist David Campbell showed in a book a long time ago called National Deconstruction. In the 1990s, people who thought of themselves as atheists before the war in Bosnia woke up one morning and found themselves identified and divided from each other by their newly salient religious identities that came from above. Contrast this now with the Arab Spring protests. The goal of the opposition in the Arab Spring revolts, including the nonviolent opposition, was to stop autocratic states' ongoing political and economic dispossession and exploitation of the people of the region. It's pretty simple, actually. Syrians did not take to the streets in order to realize a Sunni takeover of the Syrian state. As in Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, and Tunisia, the revolt had complex roots in economic grievances, social injustices, and everyday systematic oppression. These factors are all forgotten when we focus on religious grievances, identities as the engine of politics. Perhaps most tragically, privileging religion reinforces the notion that autocracy in this region is the only way to head off an endless cycle of sectarian violence. Democracy is not an option, and this is a very sad outcome. The New York Times, for example, quoted the editor-in-chief of the Catholic news agency Asia News as saying, "Christians are all saying that Syria risks becoming the new Iraq, a country divided among ethnic and religious lines where there is no place for Christians. Syria, while not a democracy, quote, at least it protects them." So this is a myth. Like other dictators the world over, the Assads ruled ruthlessly. They oppressed and they continue to oppress all of their opponents, regardless of religious affiliation. To condemn the people of this region as unfit for self-rule is eerily reminiscent of colonial narratives that we should have moved past. Unfortunately, we have not. And I think the Christian persecution and religious freedom narratives add fuel to this fire as they have done for centuries. All right, second big point. That was the Arab Spring 9/11 contrast. To enforce a right to religious freedom requires defining religion, which is not the job of the government. And this seems like a kind of obvious thing to most Americans. And what they say is, well, but religious freedom is freedom of religion. That means the government doesn't define religion, right? And then I say, well, actually, no, because in order to define a right to religious freedom, you have to define what you mean by religion and by freedom. And then you have to decide who's religious and who's not. And we're seeing this right now playing out in the courts around the vaccine, right? And the anti-vaxxers, and particularly those individuals who are claiming religious exemptions as their reason for not wanting to get the vaccine, and they're downloading forms from the internet that say I'm religious and things like that. And so who decides? That's what it boils down to. So the US has often pointed to government repression abroad to establish a need for religious freedom. And you can think about something like the Maspero massacre in Egypt, which was a really big moment in October of 2011 when the Egyptian military attacked peaceful protesters who were demanding rights for the Coptic Christian people of Egypt. There were 300 injuries, at least 25 killed. It was really bad. And it's clear from incidents like this that minorities and dissenters need international support. They need political support. They need backers. We need to have solidarity, but not necessarily as religious groups. And this is kind of the policy takeaway or the germ that the seed I want to plant in people's minds, not necessarily supporting them as Christians because of all those reasons I just gave a moment ago. So when the US interprets world events through the prism of religion and rushes to promote religious freedom, the government is forced to weigh in on what counts as a religion as opposed to tradition, culture, or superstition. Religion then gets privileged while superstition and culture do not. It's very easy, all too easy in these circumstances, as you can imagine, for the religion of the powerful, the privileged, of the stakeholders, the people who own land, the people who are in the privileged racial category, the people who are somehow have assumed the reins of authority and get to write the laws in a particular society. Those people get to decide what's going to happen, who's going to get to be a religion, who's going to be a cult or a superstition, or maybe just some antiquated cultural practice for old ladies. It's not really, we don't need to worry about that. So the US prides itself on this long tradition of freedom and disestablishment. I'm almost done here. Defining religion is not the government's job, either domestically or as a matter of foreign policy. Going back to some of Scott's comments, we could have a long debate about the First Amendment and whether it applies and whether it ever applied anywhere. But that would be an interesting topic. So if we put the government in charge of these matters, we silence all of those who cannot speak in a politically legible religious register. We take the words out of their mouth. They become invisible. We create divisions between religion, non-religion, and the rest of the world's practices, including all of those indigenous practices and others that are considered sacred to the communities that are involved, but that do not register on the radar screen of, quote, American religion, real religion, free religion. And of course, at home, there are so many examples of this. We don't have to go overseas. We could talk about indigenous practices. We could talk about Islam. We could talk about Mormonism. We could talk about dissenting forms of African-American religion that have been villainized by the FBI, for example. And of course, in our not so distant past, we could talk about Catholicism as well. So 4 quick policy recommendations. First, don't make conflict worse by reducing it to religion. The US should refrain from naming religion or religious difference as the natural or presumed cause of conflicts overseas. Religious identities and practices are important, but are never separable from other factors: economy, environment, politics, the law, territorial disputes, and so on. To single out religion as the cause of conflict misrepresents complex situations and distorts US policy options. It may also exacerbate the conflict, tragically, by reinforcing the idea that religion is the axis on which violence necessarily turns. The US should take a comprehensive and even-handed approach that accounts for economic, social, caste, public health, geographic, gender, educational, and environmental concerns, in addition to religious ones. One of my colleagues refers to this as right-sizing religion, which is one way to keep it in mind. Second, prioritize justice, equality, and respect for diversity rather than religion and religious freedom. If the US wants to reduce conflict and ensure coexistence abroad, if it does, and I'm not sure it does, but if it does, policymakers would do well to temper zealous pronouncements about religious freedom as a universal good with a bit of humility. This does not mean ignoring religion or condoning violence or discrimination. It does mean directing US resources to securing equality, economic justice, free media, an independent judiciary, environmental security, and the rights of marginalized communities, whether they're defined on religious or other grounds, such as ethnicity, race, gender, or other terms. A laser-like focus on religion blinds decision makers, in other words, to the needs of these other communities. Third, work with all local groups and don't privilege religious leaders above others. To prioritize religious leaders in US diplomacy, which has become very trendy in the past couple of decades, it empowers high-level and favored religions and leaders over others. Religious leaders should be included among other representatives of civil society, but not elevated as a special class, diplomatically speaking, who receive their own special offices and special funding. This leads to precisely those dynamics that I was describing. The US should ensure that dissenting and grassroots communities that do not present themselves as religions or are not allowed to present themselves as religions are also part of the conversation. These people have a stake in societal outcomes too, and they deserve a voice. In engaging only state-supported or recognized religions, the US is empowering them while silencing others. And this is not religious freedom by anyone's definition of the term. Last, depoliticize religion as a gesture of respect for it. Religion is woven deeply into American laws, social customs, and institutions, and it will remain so. To step back from religion as a focus of foreign policy making is not to ignore, nor is it to marginalize it. To the contrary, I see it as a way of respecting the variety and complexity of these authorities and traditions. This respect requires that the government tread lightly. Far from securing peaceful coexistence, trumpeting American versions of religious freedom abroad may not secure respect for diversity. More often than not, it may even threaten it. Thank you.
Hello. It's really such an honor to get to be in conversation with Professor Beth Hurd, whose work I have conversed with for many years. So for a change, I'm happy that this conversation is not only in my head. Okay, so my response basically consists of an affirmation of her key points about the major problems arising from overemphasizing religion in the formation of foreign policy, and that the way in which Muslims and Islam are marked, especially in the post 9/11 paradigm, reflects long colonial and Orientalist legacies. I then will conclude with taking the analysis of the violence and overemphasis on religion does to Palestine, Israel. Let me start with Deepak Kumar, who offers an extensive historical account of anti-Muslim racism going back to the 16th century. Kumar's historical analysis demonstrates why it is much more appropriate to refer to anti-Muslim policies, including the so-called war on terror, as reflective of racism rather than religious intolerance or some sort of a phobia. In other words, like Professor Hurd, for Kumar, framing the issue as about religion functions to obscure what is really at stake. The point about anti-Muslim racism illuminates the interrelations between racializing Muslims and the global manifestation of white Christian nationalisms of different varieties all over, which expressions of chauvinism include as a common denominator anti-Muslim racism. Analytically, one of the tools available here is Achille Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, entailing the governance of life and death over the post-colonial subjects in the metropolitan centers. In particular, I'm thinking of the 9/11's legacies of surveillance of mosques and Muslim communities in the US, or securitizing slums in Paris, or the PREVENT program in the UK. Indeed, we see with clarity the links between the emergence of right-wing exclusionary forms of white Christian populism in Euro-America, or what sociologist Roger Brubaker calls Christianism or civilizationism, and the shrinking democratic space therein, and the policies of counterterrorism that have defined the post 9/11 paradigm. Professor Hurd offers a critical engagement with the aggressive promotion of religious freedoms as an international policy agenda, a policy orientation that likewise, as she said, ought to be understood in the context of anti-Muslim racism and US neo-imperialism. Her criticism is not of what those pursuing such agenda claim to do and who they claim to save, but rather for what such a discourse that overemphasizes religion obscures once again. Before returning to religious freedoms, I take a short detour to another related point. Professor Hurd spoke about the other side of the post 9/11 containment policies vis-a-vis the bad religion. These are the companion policies of investing in good religion, Scott, you to anticipate. This move, which nonetheless unfolds through the same securitizing prism of bad religion that Mahmoud Mamdani captured in his famous bad Muslim, good Muslim argument, is often conveyed through phrases such as the global engagement with religion or interfaith peace building. Through a utilitarian counterterrorism or PVE or preventing violent extremism lens, engaging with, quote, good or just helpful category of people called the religious actors or the religious sector can contribute through non-military means to, so the argument goes, to stability and containment. The not so new logic is that religion and religious actors, and again, this is a highly problematic reductive category, reducing people's agency to their supposed religious identity. So this can constitute a form of soft power to mobilize, and the word that is often heard is to harness religious actors and the religious sector and capacitate it as implementing partner. It is also the logic informing other global actors such as Saudi and Turkey and their investment in religion, whether through development and mosque constructions or through underwriting centers and think tanks dedicated to such questions as religion, peace and development, as well as preventing violent extremism, while all the while engaging in gross violations of human rights, including murdering journalists. The point is not that interfaith work or enhancing people's religious literacy are not worthwhile. The point for Professor Hurd, and it is also in my own work, too, is to ask what does it obscure and how it works to depoliticize and prevent emancipatory politics and liberatory theologies as well. In the case of the former Yugoslavia, which Professor Hurd mentioned, the peace formula of segregation of Catholics, Muslims, Orthodox, and a few Jews, illuminates how the war's ethno-religious exclusionary nationalistic logic has won. A framework for intergroup cooperation framed as interfaith is deeply different from solidarity and democratic praxis. The meaning of peace is now captured in the cliche image of 3 or 4 obviously religious men who undemocratically represent or signify their respective communities. This is not to say they are not authentically religious, nor that such images are not symbolically meaningful and causal in the world. This is simply to invite us to ask, well, once again, what do they obscure? What forms of violence manifest in the silences and outside the camera's frame? So my point is consistent with Professor Hurd's analysis that stresses how an overemphasis on religion obscures actual concerns with justice, democracy, and equality, as well as historical injustices born not out of religious difference or intolerance or ignorance, but geopolitical violence. So let us return now to Professor Hurd's discussion of religious freedoms and how it has too become integrated into US foreign policy. What is of course telling is that the plight of Palestinian Christians is often bracketed out of narratives about persecuted Christian communities in the Middle East. And this is partly because of how their presence, Christian Palestinians in Palestine, destabilizes the Orientalist, civilizational, and Zionist interpretive lens, which has assimilated Israel into whiteness and the, quote, West. Why the concern for persecuted Christians do not encompass Palestinian Christians? And if it does, it operates in a depoliticized register, such as humanitarianism. As is always the case, as the aforementioned point about necropolitics of surveillance likewise conveys, international policies are also always domestic. And here religion comes in not at all as soft power, but very hard power with profound implications on the ground. Under Trump, the American embassy was relocated to Tel Aviv, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This policy outcome was a capitulation to the so-called base of Christian evangelicals, but also reflects how an unreconstructed support of annexationist Israeli policies have become mainstream into the Republican Party more broadly. And I should add parenthetically that the support of Zionism and anti-Semitism are not contradictory, but coexist in people such as Trump or Orban in Hungary. Responding to the pressure of the so-called base was also the decision to discontinue US investment in UNRWA, which is the UN agency dedicated to the needs of Palestinian refugees. Let us think also of the Christian Zionist Mike Pompeo, who, as US Secretary of State, gave a green light for Israel to annex Palestinian territories occupied in 1967. What right did he have to grant such a right? What right a little over a century ago, in 1917, did Lord Balfour have to grant Palestine as a Jewish home or a home for the Jews in the infamous Balfour Declaration? In both instances, we need to examine the role of the Christian imagination as it relates to Orientalist discourses and racialized and gendered frames. Lord Balfour, too, was a Christian Zionist, a restorationist, embedded in a settler colonial outlook. This is not just a question for some abstract academic conversation, but rather one for which Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, atheists, and left-handed or whatever paid for as they continuously experience and resist dispossession, displacement, and elimination. Further, the so-called US orchestrated and underwritten Abraham Accords signed last year between Israel and some Arab countries in the region as part of a, quote, normalization, played on the peace concept of a shared Abrahamic tradition, once again at the expense of the Palestinians who are still beholden to the logic of a Jewish supremacist nation state. The normalization agreements cynically deployed a common Abrahamic link, at least rhetorically, to cover up strategic and economic deals. What the erasures underpinning the Abrahamic Accords expose, from my reflection here, is that religion, without a methodical analysis of power ideology, including how ideology is theologically inflected, geopolitics, social and political manipulations and agenda, and global interests remain quite empty, an empty signifier, like the Abraham in the Abraham Accords. This case study illuminates how, once again, religion works to obscure root causes and inform wrong policies. Like Professor Hurd, I have argued that disarticulating religion from race, gender, class, nation, ethnicity, culture, historical memories and injustices, and the fashioning of religion as a sector works for power through social disempowerment and political disempowerment. It doesn't work for emancipatory social movements, nor does it work for marginalized persons, women and LGBTQI+ within religious communities themselves. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'd like to begin by just thanking and acknowledging Mohan and the Ansari team and other supporting institutes of the Keough School of Global Affairs for organizing this event at such an auspicious moment. I come to this conversation as a development professional, humanitarian and human rights activist, not as a scholar or specialist in religion. So my comments are informed by lived experience working in Washington, D.C. in opposition to US military and humanitarian policy in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. I'd like to focus my reflection around three topics: fear, costs, and the religious freedom narrative. I'd like to begin with fear. No matter where any of us were on 9/11, we can remember this morning very vividly. Most of our remembrance of that day is what happened in New York. In my case, I was 2 blocks up 16th Street from the White House. I was preparing for a press conference with the AFL-CIO when the first plane hit. Suddenly, we got a phone call from journalists that something was happening in New York. And then another from the White House press corps saying, we have been told to evacuate the White House and to run. Ponder that for a second. We quickly evacuated our offices and ran to the subway while the roar of F-16s flying at 2,000 feet over the White House shook the ground below us. Downtown streets were in gridlock, and in the subway, police are jamming bodies into cars. At Roslyn Station in Virginia, uniformed military are evacuating the Pentagon. Shortly after, word spread through the subway that a plane had flown into the west side of the Pentagon. No one had a clue what was going on. I tell this story to underline the impact of 9/11 in Washington, D.C. I cannot overstate what it meant for a city that sees itself as the most powerful capital in the world to be running for cover. Fear was felt palpably in the halls of power. This was a Pearl Harbor moment for the nation, but especially for those in power. Suddenly, Washington, D.C. no longer felt like the most powerful city in the world. But maybe the most important lesson from this moment is that 9/11 also made fear an asset for those with ideas about how to use it, particularly those neoconservatives in the White House who were keen to project military power abroad and drive a national radical conservative policy agenda at home. It conveniently served both agendas and would keep the president's poll numbers very high, at 85% through much of the first year of the war. While terrorist experts called for restraint and a more measured and targeted police response, the public was incited to want blood. The enormity of 9/11 created an environment in which the absence of cooler heads, vengeance was the first and most obvious response. It was what most of the public expected and what President Bush promised at the foot of the fallen towers. Meanwhile, his neocon warriors, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Pearl, etc., grasped the moment and created the fear narrative declaring the war on terror. They immediately began redefining norms and boundaries, reshaping US domestic politics, and justifying all sorts of unconventional measures and practices from torture to secret rendition jails to mass surveillance. For me, fear is the dominant narrative that in its many forms has paralyzed and rendered the American political system dysfunctional and brain dead for the last 20 years. While religion and religious freedom, as Elizabeth has pointed out, has been a central part of that fear narrative, is my belief that it is the fear narrative in many guises that has shaped both US foreign as well as domestic policy for 20 years. And sadly, we have yet to discredit or dismantle it. While it shapeshifts in perverse ways with events, it is the narrative that Republicans from Bush through McConnell and Graham under Obama to Trump and even John McCain used to justify expanding the conflict and repeated supplemental defense expenditures. Terrorists became synonymous with dark-skinned people who dress differently from us, be they Muslim, Hindu, Sikhs, Jains, or Africans. So now I want to shift to costs. So what does the war on terror cost us as a nation, morally, politically, and economically? How has it disfigured and reshaped us both at home and abroad? And I think it's important that we do this accounting at a moment like this because when seen in its totality, it's staggering. So first, cost in time. We have spent 20 years fighting a losing war on terror in 80 countries. There's much we could have accomplished over these 20 years to build a stronger and healthier America. In lives, the death toll for these conflicts stands at an estimated 929,000 people, including military on all sides of the conflict, civilians, journalists, and aid workers. This does not include all the indirect deaths for which we have no count, nor the thousands disabled by conflict-related injuries. In livelihoods, we have no way to even begin to estimate the global cost in terms of impacts on livelihoods of families displaced by conflict who lost homes, jobs, property, and loved ones. In finance, the war doubled our defense budget overnight, raising it to $800 billion per year, where it has stayed for 20 years. The Brown University Cost of War Project estimates that the US spent $8 trillion on the war on terror. The Pentagon has absorbed the great majority of the federal discretionary budget for the last 2 decades, while cynical Republicans continuously demand deep cuts and all those critical discretionary expenditures that benefit working Americans. And we will be paying off the borrowing to pay for these wars for many decades into the future. In competitiveness, The United States Congress has not had a serious debate about American global competitiveness in decades. We arrogantly presume our industrial and technical superiority and went ahead and squandered $8 trillion on wars of choice while we ignored massive needs of our population for affordable health care, preschool and educational opportunity, along with improved transportation and internet access. In political credibility, we squandered the world's goodwill toward us in the aftermath of 9/11. While we saw ourselves as saving the world from terrorists, the rest of the world saw us as engaged in an elaborate imperialist venture to exact revenge, secure our supply chains in the Middle East, and oppose the neoconservative vision of the good society from South Asia to Syria. They did not see in us the virtue we saw in ourselves. In economic fairness, we currently have the worst levels of economic inequality since decades before the Great Depression. This is in great measure due to globalization and the conservative free market economic policies of the last 4 decades. However, these same policies provided 2 unprecedented tax cuts during a war, which we've never done before, to corporations and the wealthy that shifted the costs of the wars in terms of dollars and lives to the middle and working class. In humanitarian and human rights leadership, in the interest of advancing our military objectives, we sacrificed other principles. We insisted that humanitarian organizations assume the posture of force multipliers, sacrificing their impartiality and neutrality. We insisted in embedding armed troops in civilian clothes in humanitarian relief missions. We lied about food shortages, and we authorized torture and secret rendition sites for suspected terrorists. In our national security, I would posit that the US spends more on national security than the next 10 countries combined, and yet may be more insecure as a nation today than at any time in our history. Other major powers have concluded that engaging the United States in conventional military conflict risks massive loss of life and infrastructure, and it's a losing game. They have seen through our presence in Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States is stuck in a 20th century version of how military power is exercised in a global context. Meanwhile, they've realized that disrupting the cyber connectivity of our weapons, satellite, financial, mass communications, utility, and other commercial systems could shut down our nation in a matter of minutes, create mass confusion, and render us defenseless. This could all be done without fingerprints and without firing a shot. What good are big bombs in that context? And they know we are highly vulnerable, unprepared, and underinvested in dealing with such scenarios. Beyond international challenges to national security, we face a serious threat from armed white supremacists and other armed insurrectionist groups at home. In her book, Bringing the War Home, Kathleen Belew of the University of Chicago outlines in great detail how our years of war in both Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq have created 2 generations of frustrated and angry white men who have lost faith in the American dream. And as Andrew Basovich pointed out several weeks ago, we have lost years in rethinking our national defense to face the contemporary challenges posed by a new geopolitical climate and domestic realities. Finally, some reflections on the religious freedom narrative. As a humanitarian and human rights activist, how do I respond to Elizabeth's challenge to us to rethink the role that we attribute to religion in the shaping of our foreign policy? I frankly think it's hard to dispute Elizabeth's assertion that religion has played an oversized role in the way the US has responded to the 9/11 attacks. While the Bush administration ostensibly tried to tamp down the anti-Muslim sentiment in the days immediately following the attack, the news media fed the public a steady stream of white-hot information of other potential threats coming from networks of other members within the al-Qaeda wider global network. The word jihad, as synonymous with war, was used frequently and vividly in a way that kept the Muslim identity and the intentions of the hijackers in front of the public and created a national, if you see something, say something culture. Americans were deeply afraid, but unsure what they were afraid of, beyond the images of these men in strange clothes training in some faraway mountain redoubt in eastern Afghanistan. And sadly, over 20 years, these fears and ideas about the identity of the threat were reinforced by other incidents in the UK, Spain, Germany, and the US. Fear was our vulnerability. Perhaps one response to Elizabeth is to ask, what do we need to do at home to achieve what she suggests? Maybe we need to spend some time unpacking how this image of the actors and their religion became fused in the public consciousness in a very profound way that then justified and enabled a massive military response to what was, at that point, an emergent global criminal network with a charismatic leadership and a contempt for the US. While our political class is in part responsible, there were many other voices in the mass and sectarian media who fueled the war on terror and fed the stereotypes. While I agree with Elizabeth again that religion is deeply embedded in American culture, its entry into the mainstream of American politics, and more specifically foreign affairs, is more recent. It really began in the aftermath of World War II, when Billy Graham, discovered and promoted by William Randolph Hearst for his anti-communist rhetoric, became an overnight religious celebrity who left the tent circuit and found himself being courted by President Eisenhower and his inner circle, especially those who wanting a religious voice on the front lines of the Cold War. Billy Graham was a first-class entrepreneur and vote-getter for the politicians. He originated the now famous prayer breakfast, which politicians in DC miss at their peril, put God into the Pledge of Allegiance and on our coins, and religion inside our domestic and foreign policymaking. And his son continues active in that domain today. The legacy of Billy Graham is not so much that he opened the door for faith leaders to the corridors of power, as he laid the groundwork for the religious freedom narrative that has its origins in the evangelical tradition that he preached, and that carries with it a very strong bias toward a particular form of Christianity that is highly individualistic and is uncomfortable with the emergent secular world and unfamiliar forms of faith, even ones with Christian origins and trappings. Is this religious freedom narrative that today drives much of what we now see in the form of foreign policy that Elizabeth critiques, as well as among the medical freedom movement and anti-vaxxer community here in the US. I share her concern because I don't believe that this interpretation of religious freedom is shared by all Americans, and I certainly do not believe that it is consistent with the ideas of freedom and role of religion that our founding fathers, many of whom were deists and Unitarians, had in mind when they drew up the Constitution and underlined the importance of separation of church and state. I'm concerned about the use of that term in guiding policy in any corner of our US government today, because I think it carries an implicit set of biases about what America's presence in the world represents, and it's reminiscent of the role played by colonial religionists who are often the vanguard of colonial power. The question is, can this be undone? That said, I do think there's a place for sophistication and respect for religion, spirituality, and diverse faith traditions across cultures as an attribute that should be cultivated among diplomats and development professionals who carry the responsibility of representing their country and organizations abroad. Much of what is done in the name of diplomacy and development presumes that we're fostering relationships that may change and disrupt societies where we are guests. Having some humility and a deep appreciation for the context where one works is essential for ensuring that one can make even a modest contribution toward peace building, advancing dialogues about human rights, or even negotiating with farmers over their cropping decisions. Faith and spirituality, in some form or other, has its place in every society and is layered across belief systems about ethnicity, politics, and economics that may often seem in conflict. While we may never understand with precision how these competing dimensions of society translate into decisions and action, we do need to be finely attuned to their relative importance as we move through and collaborate with representatives from these societies. An approach that privileges religious freedom as a guiding principle of policy is inevitably going to misinterpret reality and oversimplify the complex in search of a comfortable but probably inaccurate conclusion. To conclude, I'd offer two questions to Elizabeth. First, how do we strive for religious sophistication among our public servants while distancing ourselves from the national and religious biases built into the religious freedom narrative? And secondly, perhaps a bit more provocatively, how do we begin to acknowledge that we as a nation are locked in a culture war right now with religion at its center, and to realize that allowing the terms and language of this domestic culture war to shape our policy either domestically or internationally is only likely to lead us to more calamities like our post 9/11 experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was extremely rich and so much to think about and talk about. I just want to make a quick note on the time. This panel has been advertised for an hour, and that hour is up. So sorry, no. We're going to continue for probably about 15 or 20 minutes so that we can get some discussion in. I have some questions that have come in from the panel, and if you have a question, please think about it. We're going to invite you to line up at the microphone so you can articulate it for the benefit of our online audience. But first, an opportunity for Professor Hurd to respond to any of what's been said.
Oh, you know what? I want to defer to the crowd, given that we've been yammering for an hour, which I didn't even realize, and only to say one thing, which is thank you so much. This has been so interesting and so provocative. I agree with everything that you said, you collectively, ustedes. And I also want to just add in response to Ray, who asked me very specific questions. How do we deal with this question of religious literacy? How do we sort of push past the culture war? My argument there is this is a long-term project, and what it involves is presenting alternative ways of being and thinking and speaking and teaching about questions involving religion and religious difference. And I think precisely the kind of work that you're doing, Natalia, the kind of work that I aspire to be doing in the classroom, and the kind of pedagogical materials that I'm producing and trying to make available to others, and that so many of my colleagues who are working outside of the presumptions and assumptions and limitations of the culture war framing are trying to provide an alternative, trying to be differently in the world. And I think that that is really one part of what we need to do, because I think what the last thing we need to do is start screaming and yelling against either side, because that just makes it worse. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to the crowd online, whoever wants to talk there.
Questions? Yes. May I ask you to just come to the microphone? They've asked us to come from behind the cameras, but why don't you just come on up in the interest of time? Carolyn Hughes.
Thanks. Hi, I really enjoyed all the presentations. It was a fantastically interesting discussion. I suppose my question really is just to ask, and it's sort of an addition to the questions that Ray posed, which is how, given what you've said, how should we position ourselves as sort of allies of communities that have been subject to this kind of religious branding, if you like, but have then taken on that as a kind of badge of pride? And I say that having worked in Bradford, a city in the UK, at a university there where we had a lot of students of Pakistani and Bangladeshi descent who were really in the crosshairs of the Prevent program there. You know, and it had all kinds of effects on them, you know, being arrested and also being sought out by the intelligence services and things like that. And I think that they very much sort of, you know, there was a kind of a pride in our sort of Muslimness, and you know, in dealing or in trying to sort of be a kind of a supportive ally to those people. How do we sort of deal with these kind of complexities and the issues that you've raised? Thanks.
Thank you so much. I would say, this will sound funny, but doing exactly what you're doing, which is to represent these individuals and communities that you have experience with, tell their stories, make their stories available publicly, make them heard, give people voices, and then teach people what the Prevent program is, teach people what it does, the amount of resources, Natalia mentioned this program too, that are dedicated to these kinds of surveillance programs. And pay attention here at home, because recently there was an enormous appropriation coming from our broke government to fund precisely these kinds of programs. They're funding them through local associations and local governments. There are many all over the country that are receiving millions of dollars to undertake precisely these kinds of surveillance and intervention programs that are exactly the same pattern, exactly targeting the exact same communities that are racially inflected and religiously biased and very, very problematic from the perspective of democracy, transparency, and any sort of commitment to fairness. And so I think bringing them up and raising them repeatedly and, you know, making people aware of what is going on in the name of the legacy of 9/11 is a start. So thank you for doing that.
Yes, here.
Hi, my name is Prithvi. I'm a student at the Keough School. Thank you so much for your comments. I just had one question regarding the instrumentalization of sort of the boogeyman syndrome with like Islamization for America's bilateral relationships. And I talk about that with specific reference to the India-US counterterrorism cooperation. And we hear this a lot in every speech ever. We, India and US, are allies in fighting the common threat of Islamic terror. And I see that the pivotal moment of the parliament attacks in 2001 in India and the 9/11 attacks, they happened in the same year. And that was a like a sort of serendipitous convergence moment to say, now we're going to really instrumentalize this sort of othering syndrome and kind of work for sort of geopolitical gains between the India and the US. So I was just wondering what you feel about the role of Islamicization or sort of the alienation of Muslims for geopolitical and especially bilateral gains for countries that could leverage that for sort of just their own relationships and flourishing. Thank you for, yeah, that's the question.
No, go ahead. I mean, I have thoughts, but
Yeah, this is a fabulous question. Thank you so much. I think that it could be, I mean, I could spend hours on talking about this, but I think I have a student who wrote a senior thesis actually on the question of Indian foreign policy under Modi. And it's specifically its relationship with Muslim majority countries and the extent to which the anti-Muslim Indian domestic policies and laws that are now being passed are also being reflected or not reflected in Indian relations with Gulf states, with Indonesia, and so on and so forth. It's a very complex tapestry. But the one thing I would say is that I think you're absolutely right to see 9/11 and the attacks also in Mumbai as being very much a part of what leads to the power of someone like Modi coming to power, the possibility of having regimes like this. They enable each other, they feed on each other, and you're absolutely right to point out their interrelationships. So thank you. Did you want to?
yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important point, and also it's reflected in other contexts, like even in other contexts where there is collaboration between countries and the U.S. global war on terrorism. So, so what you see, for instance, how the transformation of the conflict and the discourse around the conflict in Mindanao, for instance, kind of was incorporated into that broader war on Muslim terrorism, and completely again obscure, what was going on before that, before the global war on terrorism. But what is also interesting is to see how in places like that work closely with the U.S. on counterterrorism, like Kenya and the Philippines, you see also the importation or the diffusion of anti-Muslim rhetoric that is very kind of U.S., has a U.S. flavor to it, not indigenous to the kind of contestations that were on the ground before that. So these are really important consequences.
Yes. Yes, you must come here. If I recognize you, Abdul Rahman.
Thanks, guys, for that very interesting panel. My question is, I guess, kind of basic, but maybe important. I think, what's the best way for someone like me, someone who's young, or someone who's going to be the leader of what's coming? What's the best way to kind of set yourself up to be prepared for that, to educate yourself so that you can deal with these things well? Where can you find maybe the best information, or how can you deal with the conflicts of information?
Yeah, I think that listening really carefully and thoughtfully, not only to this panel, but listening to people's experiences, reading and educating yourself about the history of the very specific contexts in which you're going to be working. So I don't know when you say you're going to be a leader, if you're talking about a specific country or the US foreign policy establishment, but whatever it is, you want to really come to terms with the complexities on the ground of the place that you're going to be engaging with, so that you understand, not just the majoritarian religion, but you understand the laws surrounding religion, you understand the colonial histories, you understand the environmental concerns, the relationships with near regional powers and great powers. All of those factors come together. And so it's just a call for education, really, and understanding, and also humility, which I mentioned once. But there are so many people who go around saying that they know everything, and there are no shortage of academics doing that. So, I'm not excluding the present company. I think listening and having a little bit of humility gets us a long way. And the US in particular could use that right now, I think. So thank you.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I just want to kind of amplify the point. One of the key, I guess, conceptual points from Beth's presentation and reflection and work that one needs to be always very careful when confronted by reductionist accounts, meaning when like really complex situations are reduced to one variable, like it's a religious conflict or it's a conflict about, whatever, economics. So that would be kind of a reductive approach. So you want to be very, kind of interrogated. And that actually leads me to think about just a reflection or reaction that I had to what Ray was mentioning about kind of what the narratives that you told about the experience of 9/11 and how it was, shock and fear. And but in some respect, this kind of fear was a form of, innocence that should have not been there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the building blocks for the kind of rhetoric and violence, anti-Muslim, especially, also Sikhs, were killed because people thought they were Muslims, but was the building blocks have been there for a very, very long time. Not to mention, of course, the important turning point. I mean, talk about the Cold War with, someone like Huntington popularizing, that clash of civilizations discourse as the Cold War ended, and supposedly a new paradigm needed to be, to come into being. That now that the Cold War was over, so it didn't come like that rhetoric. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was there. So I think it's important to also bring that historical lens to bear in, if you really want to change a paradigm.
Okay, I'm going to ask one question from online, and then after that, I'm going to provide a final prompt to conclude this panel and ask each of you to say a few words as we come to an end. So the question for online is actually targeted for Professor Ray Offenheiser, and he's asking, what evidence do you have that the U.S. is unaware of the importance of or itself unprepared for cyber warfare? And the gist of this is, could the US just be kind of obscuring its capabilities to make us think that way, whereas we're actually super powerful in this area? Do you have a reaction to that?
Who asked this question?
Their name is Kevin Brandon, so he didn't submit it anonymously, so I can share that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, very simply, and you can check me on this on national media. There's a federal agency that basically is charged with cybersecurity for the whole country. And the director literally has been on the media in recent days, basically saying she's underfunded, and that the scale of the challenge is, way larger than what the Congress has actually budgeted to enable this to be taken care of. So, and you can check that out. It's probably available for you on video.
Thank you. Well, in conclusion, let me just say the following. I'm part of an institute here in the global engagement of religion. And so I was listening very carefully to the comments that all of you had. And here's what I'm thinking. This is what I heard, and I'm going to ask you if I heard it correctly, and elicit your response as we conclude. So the notion of de-emphasizing religion and emphasizing something else, like, say, justice, that still presumes that there's something that is religion that we have to kind of extract from the equation, and there's something that is justice that presumably derives from non-religion in some way. So the definitional problems, are still there. So how do we deal with that level of complexity? And then to combine this with another question that's from online, but I'm going to rephrase it in light of my framing, is when we look at a place like Afghanistan, where a regime has come into power that says we're going to do things according to the Sharia, how does the United States and the world engage that entity in a way that de-emphasizes religion and emphasizes justice without imposing our own notions of what it means to be just in that particular context? And for us, instead of thinking of emphasizing religion and de-emphasizing religion, the way we'd like to think about it is just engaging it smartly wherever it is. So how do you think, just your final response to this question as we conclude? And maybe I'll ask Ray Atalia, and then Beth in that order. So Beth, you have the final word.
Well, I actually, I really appreciate your question, Mahan, because I've been sitting here grappling with a similar version of it. So much of the development community in the last two to 3 decades has adopted what's called a rights-based approach to development. The presumption being that, what our role should be is not necessarily, providing public goods that really are the obligation of governments, but rather we should be working with grassroots communities in the countries where we're working to help them figure out how to get access to the appropriate public services and try to do that at scale. And so and the presumption of the rights-based approach is that includes civil, political, economic, social, and cultural and religious rights. And so we end up in some sense thinking of, an oppressed religious minority as a group that has rights that should be protected by the state. So we are then in sort of the religious freedom game, and we're secular. So we're trapped. If we take your reading seriously, we face a bit of a trap there. And and then your other question, I also have been grappling with a little bit based on some prior life experience, which is, I characterize the U.S. as engaged in a very sort of complex geopolitical game across the Middle East, which it's been doing for, literally decades. But Saudi Arabia is also engaged in a complex geopolitical game across South Asia and the Middle East also. And I kind of ran into it in the Rohingya refugee camps back in the early 90s when there was an effort on the part of the UN to repatriate the Rohingya back to Myanmar after the UN had negotiated an arrangement. And the Saudi relief organizations that were in Bangladesh did not want the repatriation to happen because they were basically, their game was basically to sort of build up a sort of a Wahhabist minority to kind of strengthen the emergent sort of more conservative Islamic groups inside Bangladesh. And so this was a complicated exercise, which, was complicating the whole humanitarian scene in the camps over this repatriation question. So how does one deal with that, geopolitics from the religious side? So again, I'm using that as an example to ask your question, Mon. I don't have the answer, but I'm hoping Elizabeth does.
1 second.
Yeah, well, I also just want to hear from Professor Hurd, but I would say that the Taliban didn't come out of nowhere. And it's important to approach this question from understanding what geopolitics, how support of the Mujahideen during the Cold War, how it contributed to the realities that we have right now. This is very important. And I'll conclude by reflecting on a really powerful quote from a classic essay by Sabah Mahmood and Charles Erskine that was written about 20 years ago about the kind of like feminist majority mobilization around the invasion to Afghanistan, where they said, well, Afghani women also have a right not to be bombed, really pushing against that kind of like Orientalist gender discourse in which they are depicted 20 years ago and today. So for me, I always resist isolating the religion variable from the political or the secular, because very much like in line with Beth's scholarship, the secular in and of itself is filled with theology, yes, with the theological imagination. So that's the key to understand where it is. And this is why I also mentioned Pompeo in my remarks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you again. These are brilliant questions. We could stay here all day. I'm not going to stay here all day. I want to just say that to define religion, to corral religion, to patrol religion, to police religion, to name religion is itself secularism. That is what it means to be secular, to secularize, is to name that thing and then do something with it. Maybe you're bringing it back into public, you're putting it out of public, you're taming it, you're making it tolerant, you're repressing it, you're marginalizing it, you're worshiping it, whatever it is. Secularism fetishizes this line between religion and non-religion. It becomes a concern. It becomes a fear. It becomes something that needs to be figured out. So all of these programs that are concerned with religious rights, religious minorities, religious tolerance, religious freedom, all of them are secular. They are secularist programs because they are very, very preoccupied with religion. What I am saying is, what if we just move back from that? We stop making those demands, stop demanding what's religious and what's not religious. And this goes directly to what you're saying about Afghanistan right now, which is we need to ask, what are the laws and policies that are being implemented, imposed, written, and enforced by this government? Forget about whether they're in accordance with some definition of Sharia or not. Let's not focus on that. Let's ask what they are and how they affect the people who must live under this regime. And I will conclude with a quote too, which is, I don't know if any of you listened to which podcast, I think it was on Fresh Air. It was an interview with, it might've been The Daily, an interview with an Afghan general. I think it was The Daily, like a week or so ago. It was Daily, thank you. And this Afghan general, this is an Afghan general. He's fighting on, quote, our side. And he concluded by saying, the people are on the side of the Taliban. The people are on the side of the Taliban. And we have to get our heads around this, that this is not about Sharia, not Sharia. This is about people who have been bombed to smithereens for so many years. They've lost all capacity, agency, and autonomy, not to mention, the ability to subsist in, with human dignity. And of course, they're on the side of whoever can bring stability, peace, food, their families home, some semblance of a life. And so I think in a way, religion becomes a distraction here. And I'm trying to ask us to step back from that urgent secularist need that we have to define it and then manage it.
Well, we're so honored to have you here.